Sorry about that. That was an abrupt ending because of the batteries wearing out on the camera. But I was last talking about social deviance and, in particular, the experience of those who identify as transgendered, how they might be seen as deviant, in part because of the switching of gender, of the decision that one gender doesn't suit that person as much, and where we currently live in a society where there isn't that as the norm. So it's pretty consistent with the idea that deviance involves the violation of norms. Let's look at different ways in which deviance can relate in terms of the different theories we've talked about. Now, Durkheim talked about a functionalist perspective, so that the concern for deviance was the way in which it might have affected social cohesion, that it might look towards the nature of the social bonds that existed and alter them in some way. A big point that Durkheim ended up emphasizing had to do with solidarity, or the nature of these kinds of connections that people formed. He talked about mechanical or segmental solidarity, saying that people would come to ally with one another based on the sameness of themselves, that this was something that was more typical in a pre-modern society. He would contrast that with the idea of organic solidarity, something that would be more typical for a modern society. And from his perspective, the idea is that you'd see increased social specialization amongst individuals in a society. But because of that specialization, there'd be higher levels of mutual dependence upon one another, if you will, division of function or labor, so that you'd see the society almost functioning because of choice rather than simply identification. What you get in either form of solidarity is the idea of a collective conscience, which describes a series of common assumptions about how the world works. Without that, you'd see no basis for a kind of a moral authority, and it might otherwise lead to something like a kind of a social realignment. Consider, for example, the idea of collective vengeance and why that might relate to a collective consciousness, because it reinforces boundaries. When you look at the actions of the killer, Timothy McVeigh, part of the point to executing Mr. McVeigh was to say that his behavior was so exceptionally bad that only through the death penalty would society be able to reaffirm the kinds of social linkage that it had had. When you consider deviance, especially formal deviance, you're talking issues related to criminal justice. And in that context, we've seen two different types of responses to it. One is a rehabilitative ideal, a way in which we end up hoping to regain the individual who's deviant from society and be able to incorporate him or her back in. The author also suggests that there is a restitutive sanctions involved here, that the idea is not only to rehabilitate the offender, but also to recognize the unique or special losses that have been experienced by a victim, and that we might end up using a number of mechanisms, whether that is part of the prosecution of the individual, or whether it is something that's pursued individually by the victim through the filing of a civil suit, the use of tort law. Under the idea of functionalism, consider how deviance relates to social control. The idea is that deviance both recognizes a state where we have behavior that is beyond social control, and it also suggests the ways in which we recognize that certain norms exist and need to be followed. Social control may very well be a process by which those standards are created, and the standards may end up being focused on or originating from norms, the ways in which a society ends up coming to accept certain types of behaviors as right or wrong. You might see social control take the form of a formal social sanction, something like the punishment that would befall a defendant who's been found guilty in a prosecution, or informal sanctions, the way in which individuals have violated unspoken rules. There, the sanction might be less clear. You might see shunning of an individual, for example, or avoidance. And that's going to contrast with a formal social sanction, which ended up having a very clear and public proceeding, as well as a formal inquiry or an investigation of what would be the appropriate societal response to that kind of a thing. Far more may be addressed in our society through informal social sanctions than through formal social sanctions, partly because of the magnitude of the kinds of, if you will, offenses, the problems that gave rise to the informal sanction. The minor transgressions are much more common. So from Durkheim's perspective, the idea of a normative theories of deviance would talk about why a society would end up relying on social forces as creating the standards here. In particular, the example provided in the text involves Durkheim's perspective on suicide. The idea is that these would end up being something that are a product of social forces, not so much of individual choices, and that you'll see variations in certain populations on the suicide rate, but that's a function of those particular of the particular people in a group. In fact, Durkheim introduces a concept called social fact that would end up presuming or working off of the belief that when you're dealing with a particular group, this is how they end up handling a situation. The functionalist perspective also looks at the degree of social integration and social regulation. They seem fairly straightforward. Integration will talk about the degree to which one is made a member of a particular group, and regulation might relate to the rules needed to be able to comply with the standards for membership in that particular group. From Durkheim's perspective, looking back at suicide, he might think of it in a number of different combinations of social integration and social regulation. So think of it as a box where one axis is social integration and the other is social regulation. So that'll give you a matrix of 4 different options, and here's how Durkheim would end up characterizing those 4 options. One version of this would involve egotistic suicide, where we have an individual who's feeling so out of touch, so socially unintegrated, that this particular person feels that the isolation leads inevitably to suicide. Perhaps its opposite is altruistic suicide, where an individual feels so highly integrated that what he or she is doing is on the basis of the interests of the greater good rather than of the individual himself or herself. You might see this in terms of individuals conforming to certain group norms or standards. Anomic suicide would occur when we have social integration but the absence of regulation. So without those norms, that sort of vacuum makes suicide seem as likely a behavior as any other behavior. And then fatalistic suicide also recognizes that integration has occurred, but that there's too much social regulation, that the norms that are imposed upon particular individuals are so extreme that suicide seems like a reasonable option. The last point about talking about functionalism would look towards Merton's strain theories. Strain being a function of how an individual deviates from what is a norm, that the degree of strain would increase as someone's behavior falls farther from the norm. Merton's theory also suggests that there are certain standards or templates of behavior that people could end up following, so that you might have someone who is a conformist who accepts the standards in terms of goals and strategies. A ritualist who may end up rejecting the goals but may end up accepting the means by which those are attained, so that the process is what matters more. Innovators who are interested in reaching goals but don't care for the acceptable means. Retreatists who remove themselves from a particular society, and a rebel would end up wanting to change social institutions. That being functionalism, let me pause here and stop this particular segment before we get into symbolic interactionism theories of social deviance.